talking about shofar, there was a rabbi who had one sermon. It was about Korach, the rebel, who was swallowed up by the earth. But you can't say the same sermon every week of the year. There's only 1 week that the Torah speaks about Korach. So he would get up to the podium and he would take off his hat, and he would let the hat drop to the floor. He says, "Where's my hat? It was swallowed up like Korach." Oh, speaking of Korach, well, speaking of shofar, we've been blowing the shofar the entire month of Elul except for Shabbos. Today is the last day that we sound the shofar, and I'll sound the shofar right now before I forget.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So why do we sound the shofar? The basic answer Maimonides gives is because God said so. However, there's always a however. If you're looking for some symbolism, Maimonides' symbolism is that it's a wake-up call. But Maimonides wasn't the first person to look for reasons for the shofar, in addition to the basic reason that it's a biblical commandment. And the person who gave these 10 reasons was Rabbi Saadia Gaon. He was a 10th century rabbi. And in many ways he was like Maimonides. He was the greatest Talmudic scholar. He was also a great Jewish philosopher. He was a physician. And he was a great Jewish leader. And he came up with 10 different reasons for sounding the shofar. Each reason is a subject unto itself, and we could spend the whole class just on each of the 10 reasons. But we're going to try to go through as many as we can in the time that we have allotted. The first reason, but before I give you the reasons, the word shofar has a meaning besides meaning the ram's horn. But the root of the word is similar to another word in Hebrew that means to make something beautiful, to make something, what? Yafi. Yes, Shapir. Shifra is a woman's name, one of the 2 midwives who took care of the Jewish babies and made sure that they would be taken care of. And one of them was called Shifra, and the way it's understood is she would make the babies beautiful, she would pamper the babies. So the shofar is there to pamper us, to make us beautiful, to shape us up in a beautiful way. But how does it accomplish that? So this is why we're going to go through all the different reasons. The most basic reason given by Rabbi Saadia is that it's the way we coronate God as our king. Because God, though He's our king all the time, He's only our king for 1 year at a time. That's 1 year He's king, and then after the year is over, He says, okay, I retire. I'm no longer interested in being your king unless you ask me to be your king, because God doesn't want to be a dictator. He doesn't want to assume power against the will of the people. He wants the people to accept Him as their king. So as the year comes to an end, God says, now it's in your hands. And that's why we pray on Rosh Hashanah, and in our prayers we're saying, please God, be our king. But it doesn't become a reality until the shofar is sounded. But there's also a deeper understanding of that, how it pertains to us. Yes, we're accepting God as our king. We're accepting His authority. But it's also accepting the idea of kingship in ourselves, the power of royalty in our own lives. And the shofar is what coronates us and brings out the power of royalty in our own lives. Because what is a king? A king is the head of the nation. So number one, it tells us to always look for the head. Always try to emphasize the head, whether it's the head of the people whose heads are screwed on right. Because in our religion, in Judaism, we trace our Judaism back to Sinai through the main teachers of Judaism, the heads of the Jewish people. And therefore, by connecting ourselves to these heads, to the great sages of all times, we are a nation with a head. There's an expression that we should be heads in our prayers and not be tails. What is the difference between a head and a tail? The head leads, the tail follows. So while it's important for us to be followers, we also have to be heads. We have to emphasize the idea that we are heads. We are not just followers. And how does that apply to us on a daily basis? A tail is what follows. It doesn't have any initiative of its own. It just follows. Every day of our lives, we're following the day that preceded it. Today, I wake up in the morning, I have yesterday's achievements. They're already behind me. I can't rely on them. I have to look to forge ahead. I have to look for ways of focusing on leading in my own life, in our own lives, and leading others as well. That's what it means to be ahead. To be ahead means that you are not just following, even if it's following yourself, because even if you could be the greatest innovator, you invented everything you could think of, and you wake up the next day, you can't say, well, I invented 1,000 things, why do I have to do anything new today? Well, when it comes to scientific inventions, you may be right, but when it comes to spirituality, you can't rely and rest on your laurels.
Welcome to Lively. Your device is ready to be used.
So that's what we mean when we say to be ahead, to always forge into new territory, and never say, I carved out a comfortable niche for myself, and I'm happy the way I am. We should be very happy with our accomplishments, but never be satisfied. That's number one. So the first reason is that we're proclaiming God as our King, and we're focusing on the head. And that's why it's customary in Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, we put a lot of emphasis on symbols. Judaism is not about symbols. Judaism is about doing things that are real, not just symbolic. We don't, for example, put on tefillin because it's a symbol of something. It may be a symbol of something, but the reason we put it on is because right now, as we put it on, it's generating spiritual energy into our lives. But there's one exception to that rule. Rosh Hashanah, we focus on symbols. Because Rosh Hashanah is the time when we're connected to the head. It's the head of the year. Rosh Hashanah is translated as head of the year. We don't use the word Tchilat Hashanah, the beginning of the year, but the head of the year. Now, if a person scratches a toe, it might hurt, it can cause an infection, but if you make the same scratch on the brain, it affects the whole body, the whole organism. Rosh Hashanah is a day when we're connected to the head of the year, and everything we do on Rosh Hashanah has significance. So a symbol is not just an arbitrary symbol. A symbol has meaning, has depth. And one of the symbols of Rosh Hashanah is to eat, I don't want to gross anyone out, the head of a lamb or the head of a fish. If you can't tolerate it, just keep it on the table. And focus and let someone else eat it. Focus on the head. We want to be heads in every respect, because this is the day when we proclaim God as our head. This is the head of the year, and then we ask to be heads. The second reason he gives is it's a way of proclaiming that there's a season ahead, a very special season. It's in the olden days when they had monarchs. They would make declarations, and they would come with a trumpet and blast a trumpet to announce that this is a period for whatever it was that they wanted it to be designated for. We are now designating 10 days of Teshuvah, 10 days of repentance, or more accurately, 10 days of return. So why do we have to make such a fanfare? Why do we have to blow a shofar, blow a trumpet? It's not a trumpet, but in the temple they actually blew the trumpet as well with a shofar. But we just blow the shofar. But the idea is that we're making a clarion call. We're announcing to the whole world, these are 10 days of Teshuvah. What is the symbolism behind that? Is that we are declaring that we have the power to change. We have the power to return. No matter how far a person thinks he or she has strayed, you can come back. There's never a time when it's too late to come back. There's a story in the Talmud, I told this in an earlier class, where one of the great rabbis, Elisha ben Avuya, rebelled against Judaism. We're talking about a towering scholar, a great sage, and he was the teacher of many other of the great sages, and he rebelled against Judaism, he rebelled against the Jewish people, and he became a real rotten person. And he had one student that didn't abandon him, Rabbi Meir. And one day Rabbi Meir says to him, "My teacher, why don't you return?" And he said, "Because there's a heavenly voice," the Talmud says, that emerges from Mount Sinai every day and beckons us to return to God. It says, I hear that voice, but it has an addendum to it. It says, everyone return to God except for you. You're a lost cause. And that was his big mistake. There's no such thing as a lost cause. Even if God himself tells you you're a lost cause, that is a challenge for you to overcome the obstacles. And sometimes God creates the obstacles, and we don't understand, why do we have these obstacles? I'm trying to do the right thing. God wants to make our changes more meaningful, so he puts obstacles in our way. So when we announce that these are the days of Teshuvah, we're really announcing we have the ability, we have the capability of changing, because we're not really changing, we're returning to our true inner self. But why 10 days? Because the Kabbalists tell us that every person comprises 10 different faculties, 3 intellectual, 7 emotional, and Teshuvah has to affect and can affect every one of our attributes. So if you're missing something, and we're all missing something in every one of our attributes, because we're not perfect, because perfection is not something that we achieve, we aspire to, because God is infinite, and you can't be, in that sense, you can never achieve everything, because there's no limit to everything. We keep on changing, we keep on bettering ourselves, and we could bring changes to each one of those 10 faculties. There was a, yes?
Do both men and women possess the 3 intellectual?
Yes, everyone possesses them. Some possesses...
The same ratio?
Everyone is different. Every individual is different. Some people are more intellectual. Some people are more emotional. Some people have more of one emotion, more of another emotion. But we all have all 10. If you're a human being, we have all 10. We'll have another class on the 10 attributes. That'll take us the whole class if I have to go through all 10. So there was this, I started telling the story, there was this Hasidic rabbi who married off his daughter to another Hasidic rabbi, and every Shabbos, after the prayers, then there would be a kiddush. People would sit down to eat the meal, the Shabbos meal. But his son-in-law was still praying for hours and hours. So the father-in-law was a little upset. And he says to his son-in-law, you know what, you should be part of the community. Everyone prayed together. however long it took, and everyone is now sitting at the meal. Why are you praying so long? Could you promise me that next week you won't pray that long? He says, yes, I promise you. Next week I'll pray with the community. Next week, same thing happens. He's still praying for hours and hours. So the father-in-law calls him in and says to him, you promised that you're going to pray with the community. He says, I did. He says, what do you mean you did pray with the community? He said, because we have 10 faculties, and my 10 faculties are scattered all over, and it took me time to bring them all together into the prayer. Well, that's what Rosh Hashanah and the 9 days that follow are all about, bringing the idea of Teshuvah into each one of our faculties, not just rely that I changed one aspect of my being. But Teshuvah requires that we dig deep into our personalities and we discover things that may not be so good. Some of us, present company excluded, may not be perfect. So how do you know how imperfect you are? You have to introspect, you have to go deep inside. And what helps you dig deep inside, it's the shofar. In the Torah portion we read yesterday, there's a verse that says, perhaps there is among you a man, woman, family, or tribe whose heart is straying today from God our God to go and worship the deities of those nations. Perhaps there is among you a root that produces poison, hemlock, and bitter wormwood. And that's the end of that verse. And commentaries point out that the 4 words in Hebrew about the root that produces the poison, those 4 words, shoresh, pore, rosh, vilana, you take the initials of those 4 words, it spells shofar. So what does that have to, and also it has the word rosh in it. So it's a hint to Rosh Hashanah and the blowing of the shofar. But what does that have to do with finding the poison? Because on Rosh Hashanah and the 9 days that follow, the shofar is what helps you reach the deepest parts of your personality that need to be changed, that need to be beautified, and you're able to reach them as well. No matter how deep your negative energy goes, the shofar helps you dig out that energy. And that's what Teshuvah is. Teshuvah is reaching inside of ourselves to find the good in ourselves and to root out the negative. Reason number 3. When God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Torah describes how God sounded the shofar. He sounded a shofar. That was the power that God demonstrated at Sinai. And when we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, it's to remind us of what happened at Sinai, when we received the Torah and we accepted the Torah. We told God, yes, God, we will accept the Torah, we will listen to everything you tell us. And what happened at Sinai when God said the immortal words, I am God, your God, those words are phrased in the singular. Usually the Torah, when it speaks to the nation, uses the plural. But here in Ani, we say in the Shema, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am God, your God, plural. But in the 10 Commandments, it's Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your singular God. That means that God programmed himself into each and every one of us individually. That's what we're supposed to remember when we hear the shofar, how we have this very, very personal relationship with God. And the whole experience of Sinai was a romantic one. It's our courtship and our engagement and our marriage to God. That's what took place at Sinai. There's a book, a biblical book called Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. It's a love song. It's a very erotic love song that King Solomon composed. And the Talmud says, Rabbi Akiva says, all of the Torah, all of the Tanakh is holy. The book of the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. It's the holiest book in the whole Torah. Why? Because it talks about the most intimate relationship that God has with us. And that relationship started at Mount Sinai. So when we come Rosh Hashanah to God and we ask God to give us a good year, we remind ourselves, we remind God, but God doesn't have to be reminded, but it's remind ourselves of that relationship that we had with God. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the famous Hasidic master, had a parable for this. The parable was a king was wandering in the forest and he got lost. And he was traveling for who knows how long, and he was ready to give up. And then he sees a little hut in the forest, and he knocks on the door, and the man brings him in and takes care of him, gives him food and drink, gives him ability to wash himself and to refresh himself, and saved his life, essentially. And after the king finally recovers and regains his strength, he goes back to his palace. But before he leaves, he tells this Jew that he wants to, or Jew, the parable doesn't say if he's a Jew or not, but we like to have Jews in everything. So he tells him, I want to see you at the palace. And he brings him to the palace, and he invites him to become one of his trusted advisors. And he provides him with a beautiful palace, provides him with servants, with everything. He gives him a tremendous reward because he was so grateful for saving his life. But then years go by, and the person did something that was disrespectful to the king. And according to the law of the land, that was a capital crime. And the person was sentenced to death. And when people are sentenced to death, he always gives them a last request. So he says to the king, could I ask for something before you hang me? And the king says, sure, we grant that to everyone. He says, I want you to get dressed in the same clothing that you wore, the ripped garments that you wore when I saved your life, and I will wear the same clothing that I wore then. And when the king was reminded of how this man saved his life, he pardoned him. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev said the same thing. When God wanted to give the Torah, giving of the Torah was not just a nicety. Giving of the Torah was to justify the creation of the universe. The whole universe and God's plan for the universe depended on someone accepting the Torah. And the Midrash tells us that God went to all the different nations of the world and he asked them if they would like the Torah. And each nation said, "Can you give me a sample?" God says to one nation, "Thou shalt not commit murder." We live by murder. We live by the sword. It's not for us. Another nation said, "Give us a sample." And God said, "Don't commit adultery, don't steal." And each nation rejected the Torah. When it came to the Jewish people, they said, "Na'aseh v'nishma," we will do it, whatever you tell us, and then we'll hear what it's all about. And that's what saved the world and saved God's plan. So on Rosh Hashanah, when God judges us, and maybe the judgment won't be so positive, we remind God, it's reminding ourselves, of course, but the way it's phrased is we remind God of how we saved the day when we received the Torah at Mount Sinai.
So the judgment is just of the Jewish people, not on...
No, Rosh Hashanah, the judgment is for the whole world. But as Jews, we come before God and say, look, we have something that you owe us something because we accepted, we embraced the Torah. And without the Torah, there'd be no world. So we're representing the whole world. The fourth reason is it reminds us of the prophets. The prophets are likened to a shofar. A shofar, when you hear the shofar blast, you wake up, it awakens you, it jolts you. And the prophets were sent to jolt us. Why did God send prophets? Because when prophets were not there to change any laws. If a prophet comes and he proves that he's a prophet, he performs miracles and says, God told me to tell you that you no longer have to keep the Sabbath. You no longer have to put on tefillin. You no longer have to do any of the mitzvahs. You know that is a false prophet. By definition, a prophet is not there to change anything. He's there to advise us, to encourage us, to inspire us, to jolt us into doing what we know we're supposed to do. He's not there to add anything or subtract anything. So a prophet is like a good friend. He could be open, he could be frank, he's an advisor, he's like a caring therapist. And sounding the shofar reminds us to seek out a mentor in whom we could confide. We are humans with all the frailties and limits of human beings. We can't do everything on our own. We need to depend on others, and even the most stable person needs to have someone, a friend, in whom they could confide. And the shofar reminds us to seek out such people. Seek out people who could be your counselor. And not just a counselor for your psychological health, but also for your spiritual health, because the spiritual health is just as important, if not more important, than the psychological health. You can't have one without the other. Reason number 5. The shofar reminds us of what happened when the temple was destroyed, or the enemy was blasting their trumpets. So the shofar reminds us of the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple is something that we're always supposed to remember. Even at weddings, the happiest of occasions, we break a glass. Why do we break the glass? To remind us that our joy is still incomplete because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. And our relationships are incomplete as long as our relationship with God is incomplete. And where did our relationship with God manifest itself most strongly? It was in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple. So in a time when we're trying to start a new life together in a marriage and start a very powerful relationship, we have to recognize that that relationship will only be strong if it's connected to the Beit HaMikdash, it's connected to the Holy Temple. And if we don't have the Holy Temple and the Temple Mount physically, there's the Holy Temple within each and every one of us. That's our inner spirituality, our inner innocence. And that each of us has to build his own temple. Yes, we pray and we anticipate Mashiach's coming and rebuilding the temple physically, literally, but until that time, we have to build our own spiritual temple. You know, there's a story in the Torah about Joseph and his brothers. When Joseph finally exposes his identity to his brothers, he embraces his brother Benjamin. And it says that Benjamin cried on Joseph's shoulder, and Joseph cried on Benjamin's shoulder. So Rashi explains, what were they crying about? They were crying, they were both prophets. Joseph foresaw that the temple that would be built in the part of Israel that belonged to the tribe of Benjamin would ultimately be destroyed. So he was crying for the loss of the temple in Benjamin's territory. Benjamin, on the other hand, was crying for the temple that was built on Joseph's land. Before the temple built in Jerusalem, the temple was built in a place called Shiloh, and it lasted for 369 years, almost as long as the first temple. It's lasted 410 years, and that was destroyed by the Philistines. So Benjamin was crying for Joseph's destruction. So the Rebbe once asked, why didn't they cry for their own destruction? Joseph could have cried for the loss of his temple, and Benjamin could have cried for the loss of his temple. Why was Benjamin crying for Joseph's loss, and Joseph was crying for Benjamin's loss? And the Rebbe answered very poignantly. He says, if it's your own temple, there's nothing to cry about. Build it. That's your mission. If you see your temple is destroyed, if the inner spirituality is lacking, that's your mission to build it, and everyone has the power to do that. You can't build someone else's temple. You could help them, you could assist them, you could encourage them, you could inspire them, but they have to do it themselves. So when it comes to our temple, which is what we're reminded of when we sound the shofar, it gives us the message, our mission, our job, our objective is to rebuild our own inner temple. The 6th reason is it reminds us of the Akedah. The Akedah literally means the binding. When God says to Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and offer him as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. That's where the temple was eventually built. And Abraham was prepared to do it, and then the last second, an angel calls out, this is not what God had in mind, this is a test. So we always invoke the memory of the Akedah. If ever God doesn't like the way we behave and we need to have some merits and we don't feel we have enough merits, we always invoke the Akedah, saying, look what our ancestor Abraham did. He's the father of the Jewish people, and look what he was prepared to do because he was devoted to doing whatever you told him to do. So instead of Isaac being sacrificed, what happened right afterwards? He sees a ram and he sacrifices the ram. And what happened with that ram's horns? So our sages tell us that the two horns, one horn was reserved for Mount Sinai. That's the horn that became a shofar that ushered in the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the other horn will be reserved for ushering in the coming of Mashiach. So when we hear the shofar, that reminds us of what happened at the Akedah and reminds us that we should make our own little sacrifices. That means that we should be prepared to give away something that is precious to us for a higher cause, whether it's helping someone, whether it's giving charity, whether it's waking up early in the morning to go to the shul to pray. Everyone has their own sacrifices that sometimes may be very hard, but that's exactly what God is looking for us. Are we prepared to give of ourselves for others? And the truth of the matter is that there's no such thing as a real sacrifice, because every sacrifice is really, the Hebrew word for sacrifice is korban. Korban comes from a root which means bringing close. We're bringing ourselves closer to God by doing that sacrifice. And some people feel that unless you're doing a major sacrifice, you're giving your life. And unfortunately, we're living in an age where Jews have to give their lives for survival. The soldiers that give their lives in Israel to protect the land of Israel, which is under attack by people who want to wipe out every man, woman, and child, which is unparalleled. There's no other nation on earth that has to worry about being wiped off the face of the earth just because they happen to be Jewish. And the soldiers are there defending us and risking their lives, and many of them have paid with their lives. That's the ultimate sacrifice. But we're not asking everyone to give their lives. God put us here in the United States, and we don't have to give our lives. Although people could be in the army here in the United States and they're putting their lives on the line as well. Not quite the same way as it is in Israel, but most of us are not in the army where we have to risk our lives. So people will say, what is the value of a sacrifice? We're not going to do the big sacrifices. A little sacrifice is such a valuable thing in God's eyes. No one should underestimate the power of just a little sacrifice. There's a story I shared once before, that the Rebbe was once in a very down mood because of all the pressures of the Jewish people's problems. The Rebbe would get hundreds of letters every day, literally hundreds of letters every single day of the year. There was a point, I think, where he got about almost 1,000 letters a day. And 95% of those letters were bad news. People saying, I'm suffering from this problem, from that problem, from this illness, from that problem, and asking for the Rebbe's blessing and guidance. So he was down, and his aides tried to cheer him up by mentioning to him all of his accomplishments. This institution was just built, and this synagogue was dedicated, and all these things, and it didn't help. What changed his mood was he got a letter from a child, a 10-year-old child. I remember the child was from Detroit, and the child said that whenever he went to school, he would say his morning prayers on the school bus, but it was pretty rowdy. So he decided, he made a resolution, and he would wake up 10, 15 minutes earlier and say his prayers at home. And he wrote to the Rebbe to tell him about this. And the Rebbe's mood changed drastically. And he wrote the child a letter, and he says, you should know that what you wrote to me was like cold water on a weary soul. But what was it? A kid wakes up 10 minutes earlier, but that was a sacrifice for that kid. And the Rebbe was trying to show that the little sacrifices have infinite value. We shouldn't just think we need major sacrifices. We have to give our lives. Just little gestures, because there's a resistance to it, that has so much value. So when we talk about the Akedah, we shouldn't get the idea that you have to be prepared to sacrifice your life or someone else's life. No, it's the small sacrifices that have the greatest value as well. Sometimes, and this comes to the seventh reason, sometimes we have to use tough love. The prophet states, "Shall the shofar be sounded in the city and the people not tremble?" Sometimes you have to instill fear. That's not the ideal. We don't focus on getting people frightened. You don't focus on using fire and brimstone. There were people who did that, but that's certainly not the proper way, ideally. But sometimes you have to use some tough love and a little bit of shattering and fear to break the shell. Sometimes the shell is so thick that you can't break the shell and let the person express their true spiritual feelings. And the story, I told this many times, was when the fourth Chabad Rebbe passed away. He left 3 sons, and there was a question of who should succeed him, the older brother or the middle brother. And the middle brother was 22 years old. And the older brother said the middle brother should be the next Rebbe, and the middle brother said the older brother should be. So they for 10 years there was no official Rebbe. But unofficially, they divided up the responsibilities. The older brother would give spiritual counsel, and the middle brother would give, more down-to-earth advice. Even though they were really the opposite. The older brother was a businessman, became a businessman, and the younger brother was totally spiritual. But this is what they made up. And this one man comes to the younger brother with a very serious spiritual problem, and the Rebbe, who then became the Rebbe, 22-year-old, says to him, "I'm sorry, I can't help you." He says, you have to help me. There's no one who can help me. They're my last resort. And the Rebbe said, "I'm sorry, if I could help you, I would help you. I can't. You're beyond help, as far as I'm concerned. I can't help you." And the man left the room, and he sat down in the vestibule, and he sat down crying bitterly. So the older brother, who was in an adjoining room, hears the man crying. He goes over, he says, "What happened?" He says, "I went to your brother, I told him my problem, and he says he can't help me. And I pleaded with him, and he says, 'No, I'm sorry.'" So the older brother goes into his younger brother and scolds him and says, "Look, there's a Jew who's crying bitterly because he has such a problem. Why didn't you help him?" So he says, "Tell him to come back in." And he comes back in and he helps him. And he gives him advice, which was perfect for him, and the man's problem was solved. So later on he explained, "Why didn't I help him? Because I saw the man was beyond help. If I would have given the advice, it would not have helped him." But when he broke down crying, he was so shattered, that opened up his soul to become receptive to my advice. And that's why I had to reject him. The rejecting was my way of getting him to be receptive. That is a last resort type of thing, and I always share this story with my brother. That a perfect example of this, how this happened. There's a tradition from the great Kabbalist, the Arizal, that a person during the 10 days has to become so inspired that at least at one point they shed some tears, they cry. And if you don't, that means your soul is imperfect. You have a defective soul. So one of my brother's students, was a brilliant student, comes to my brother on Rosh Hashanah, or right after Rosh Hashanah, he says, "I read about that," but he said, "But I didn't cry. I mean, I wasn't inspired enough to cry. Does that mean I'm defective?" My brother says, "No, it doesn't mean anything. You have 9 days to go. You have plenty of time." Well, 9 days go quickly, and now it's Yom Kippur, and it's after Kol Nidre. Very emotional, very inspiring, and he says to my brother, "Nothing happened. It didn't move me." So my brother says, "Look, you have 4 other prayers. Yom Kippur is not over." To make a long story short, after each prayer, he went over to my brother, who was his mentor, and nothing was working. So my brother said, "Look, at the end of the last prayer, when everyone declares Shema Yisrael, that's the most powerful declaration of Shema Yisrael, where it says that when you say those words, Shema Yisrael, you're supposed to imagine that you're being killed because you're a Jew, and you're giving your life rather than betraying your belief in one God. And that's what you're supposed to think when you say those words. And then you say Baruch Shem 3 times. Then you say Hashem Hu Elikim, God is the real God, 7 times. And everyone says it together. It's the most inspiring thing. And after that, the Chabad custom was to sing a march, Napoleon's March. It's a tune of victory. And the Rebbe would go stand on his chair and then later on a platform and would jump up and down and the whole crowd would go crazy. This was the climax of Yom Kippur. He says, after that, then it's going to work. And after that, it goes over. He goes over to my brother, it didn't work. So my brother says, you have a defective soul. And he broke down crying. So sometimes you need to use, as a last resort, you have to shatter the person. And and we have enough going on in the world to shatter us. It doesn't take a long meditation to be able to reach that feeling. Sometimes what awakens us, like the 6-Day War, the Rebbe once said that the Holocaust and later on the 6-Day War in different ways were like a shofar. And the 6-Day War, those of you who are old enough to remember, inspired or awakened the Jewish people in tremendous ways. And now, tragically in our own time, October 7th, awakened Jewish people. There's been a surge of Jews returning to Judaism, especially in Israel. Thousands upon thousands of people are putting on tefillin. Thousands upon thousands of people are putting mezuzahs on their doorposts. That's the shofar that we're talking about. Sometimes it doesn't have to be to frighten us, it's there to jolt us. Then, reason number 8 is to remind us of the final day of judgment. The shofar reminds us, what do we mean by judgment? Judgment means accountability. We know that our lives have purpose. And there's a judge who holds us accountable, who scrutinizes every detail of our lives, because every detail counts. So we have to recognize that we can't just live our lives, just let it coast along. There's accountability for us at the end. And the shofar reminds us that we're going to be held accountable, and that God counts everything that we do, good and evil. And we should strive that the good should outweigh the evil, that the positive should outweigh the negative. Reason number 9, ingathering of the exiles. When Mashiach comes, how do we know Mashiach is Mashiach? What's the definitive test? Maimonides, when he describes Mashiach, describes him as a great Jewish leader steeped in Torah, someone who repairs the breaches in Jewish practice, someone who fights wars, whether it's physical or spiritual wars. Then he builds, that person is presumed to be Mashiach. But then, in order for it to become certain, he has to build the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. And the final test of Mashiach is he gathers all the Jews from all parts of the world, including Buffalo and Williamsville, and brings them to Israel. Then you know that Mashiach is here for certain, because that's the ultimate goal of bringing all the exiles together, and that'll be ushered in with the sound of the shofar. So how does that relate to us? Why do we have to focus on that on Rosh Hashanah? Because, as I said before, this is to tell us that we have to organize all of our faculties as well. I told you the story of the son of the Rebbe who lived with his father-in-law, and he took his time for praying because he said, I have to get my faculties together. But that also means why is it so important that Mashiach, the Messianic age, will feature the exiles coming together? Because what's so important in Judaism is the community. Yes, every individual counts. It says if one Jew would have been missing at Mount Sinai, God would have not given the Torah. Every Jew counts. It counts individually. There's a story I think I once told of an older colleague of mine who went to an island somewhere in the Caribbean where there was a small Jewish community, and he got all the men together and he got them to put on tefillin and to pray together. And he wrote a report to the Rebbe about all these accomplishments, which was pretty inspiring and something to be proud of. You were able to score a 99. You did everything except there was one man who was missing because he was out of town. He was out of the country. So when he wrote his report to the Rebbe blessed him for his accomplishment, but then the Rebbe said, but what about that person that was missing? When are you going to get to him? In other words, the Rebbe was saying, you can't be satisfied just because you score in baseball. If you score 300, you're a very good batter. But in Judaism, you need 100%. But of course, very few people could even get close to 100%, but you have to strive for that. You can't say, I did well. In God's judgment, maybe that's how God will judge us, but we cannot be satisfied with doing well. We have to strive to get every little detail. Everyone counts. But in spite of that, the Judaism also focuses on the community. We have to be part of a community. We have to feel the pain of the community and rejoice in the positive things of a community. And it's the community that has this great power. If there were, let's say, 9 people of the caliber of Moses would come to the synagogue one day and they would want to say Kaddish, the rabbi would say, no, you can't say Kaddish because you need a minyan to say Kaddish. Kaddish and other related prayers are considered to be so powerful that you need the community to be present. You need the 10 men. So 9 people of the caliber of Moses. So the service is over and they all leave. And then there are 10 simple, illiterate Jews who happen to be walking by, and they say, come in. And then they say Kaddish. So 9 Moses can't say Kaddish, 10 illiterate Jews who are not even observant, who are just as far you can go from Judaism and Jewish practice, they make the minyan because they represent a community. The power of a community is much more than the sum total of 10 individuals. So while we focus on and we extol the virtue of every individual, we also focus on and extol the importance of a community. Then we go to reason number 10, the final reason that Rabbi Saadia Gaon gives, that when Mashiach comes, there are different opinions as to how long it'll take place and how many stages, but eventually the dead will come back to life. And that will be ushered in by the shofar. So it's a reminder of that. But what does that have to do with Rosh Hashanah? Why is that so important to remember on Rosh Hashanah? True, it's one of the 13 principles of faith. But why is the focus on Rosh Hashanah? So one possible explanation is that we have to bring life into things that are dead. One of the things that is dead is intellect. Pure intellect has no life to it. If a human being was just a brain with intellect and that's it, that would be considered a dead person. You have to bring life into the intellect. You have to become sensitive. You can't just, and when you look at the greatest Jewish scholars, and sometimes when you think of scholars and let's say professors in universities, they're living in ivory towers, they're just intellects, they're academics. They're not, we don't look at them as empathetic people with feelings. But in Judaism, it was never that way. The greatest leaders and scholars were also very, very human in the way they express their emotions. Maimonides, for example, is a perfect example. Maimonides was the most towering scholar. His brain was you can fit 100 Einsteins in his brain, and yet he was such a warm person, he was such an empathetic person. The way he treated his patients, he treated everyone, his enemies, he writes, that would come to him for treatment. And Maimonides was so emotional when his brother drowned. He was just such a, I don't want to use the word mensch because he's way beyond that. But people who are just pure intellect, they're not alive. Another definition of death, the Zohar says, death does not mean the end of something. Death can mean a decline. A person who's on a certain spiritual level and they decline relative to their original level, we say that they had died. So you have to revive that. Even if sometimes we regress and we feel, okay, we reached our high point and then we regressed. We're not going to come back. It's not going to be possible. No, we have to rejuvenate ourselves. The Shofar reminds us to bounce back, that falling is not permanent. Nothing is permanent in life. Even death is not permanent, contrary to the famous saying. Even death is not permanent because the dead will come back to life. Certainly when we experience decline in our lives, we shouldn't take that as being permanent. So these are the 10 reasons, but there's also an 11th reason given by the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov gave this famous parable of a prince who was sent away, far away from home. The king wanted the prince to learn how to struggle, how to become a real strong person without having the support of the palace, of all the wealth and all the trappings. So he sends the prince to a faraway land. He sends with him advisors to help him. He gives him a lot of money so he should be able to live, have something to live on, and hoping that this will develop character. Well, little by little, the prince started to develop relationships with the wrong people. He dismisses his advisors. He uses all the money, then he becomes a beggar. He gets into the wrong things and the wrong people, and months go by, and all his clothing is ripped and soiled. His hair is growing long. He looks so disheveled. He hasn't, and even his language became so coarse and so not regal. And then he realizes how far he had strayed. He says, now it's time for me to come back to my father. And he travels for who knows how long before he can get back to the capital city. He comes to the capital and he tells people he's the crown prince, and they all laugh at him, they mock him because he didn't look like anything close to that. And he finally comes to the palace entrance and he says to himself, but now I'm really lost, because they're not going to let me in. They don't recognize me. I don't even speak the language. No one will understand what I have to say. And he realizes that he's lost, that he's so close to the king, and yet he's so far, because the king will never recognize him. So he breaks down crying from the depths of his heart. And when the king hears the cry of his child, he recognizes it, and he rushes out of the palace and takes him into his embrace. And that's the shofar. The rest of the year we may stray, we may go far away from our father, the king. We are the crown prince. And God wants us to not have Rosh Hashanah every day. He wants us to develop character. But sometimes we stray, and when we come back in Rosh Hashanah and we discover that we don't even know how to pray properly, when we hear the sound of the shofar, that reminds us of the inner cry of our soul, and God takes us into his embrace. One final thing. One of the sounds of the shofar is what happened to it? Is the broken sound. In the Torah, that sound is called teruah. Now, teruah is a Hebrew word, but it wasn't clear what that word means. So the Aramaic translator translates it as yevava. Now, everyone here who speaks Aramaic fluently knows what yevava is. The only reason I know what yevava means is because the Talmud told me what it means. And yevava is connected to a Hebrew word in a story in the book of Judges, the biblical book, where the Canaanite general, Sisera, was fighting a war against the Jews, and he was defeated, and he was killed. And his mother is looking through the window, and she's saying, "Where is my son?" The evil mother of the evil general is crying, and the Hebrew word for crying is tiyabev, the same root as the word yavava. So from that we know that the sound of the shofar, the broken sound, is a sound of crying. And the question is, why do we derive something from a wicked woman who's crying because her wicked son didn't survive the war of attacking the Jews? And the simple answer is that it's the cry of a mother. And the cry of a mother is the most pure and precious type of cry. But it's also has a deeper meaning. God is also our mother, the Shekhinah. When we talk about God as the majestic God, the King, the one who's beyond us, transcendent. And we also talk about God as the God who dwells within us. That's what the word Shekhinah means, the indwelling of God. That's the feminine aspect of God. And the feminine aspect of God is looking through the window, because we create barriers. We create barriers between us and God. And there's a window that if we open that window, and that's what the shofar does, it opens the window for us, that we can hear God's cry, that He's saying to us, it's time that we get back together again. It's time that you return from all the negatives. It's about time that I can take you into my embrace. And it's not an accident that the Hebrew word for window, which is used only one other time in Tanakh, my wife told me, is the word eshnav. It's not a common word. The common word for window in Hebrew is chalon. But here it uses the word eshnav. The word eshnav numerically adds up to the same numerical value as Mashiach. And there's a verse in the Song of Songs that God is looking through the window, and that sometimes some explain that that's with reference to Mashiach. Mashiach is looking through the window, waiting for us to shape up, for us to come back. And that's what the shofar reminds us of. The cry of the mother, the cry of God, the cry of Mashiach is asking us to come back, because Mashiach wants to come. People say, why doesn't Mashiach come? It's not up to Mashiach to come. It's up to God to make him come. And what makes God change his mind about things? We do. So when we come to hear the shofar, that's one way of, quote unquote, awakening God. How could I use such a blasphemous term, awakening God? But it's a biblical verse. King David says in Psalms, Ura, wake up, Lama Tishan Hashem, why are you sleeping, O God? That means, just like when a person is asleep, what does that mean? That his soul has partially left his body. And that's why you're not in control of what you're thinking. Same thing is true when God withdraws from the world. When he's not present in the world, it's like sleeping. And we ask God, when we blow the shofar, God, wake up, become more present in this world. Look through the window and take us out of exile and bring us into your embrace. Any questions? So you have 10, actually I gave you about 12 reasons for the sounding of the shofar. I don't know of any other mitzvah that has so many reasons attached to it. I'm sure if I'd search I'd find, but that doesn't come to mind. Yes?
So that being said, how you gave us the 12 reasons so eloquently, why do we only blow a shofar once a year? There are certain things we do 3 times a year. I mean, we do it multiple times a year. Why do we wait till once?
Because God's withdrawal from the world happens once a year. Right before Rosh Hashanah, that's when he says, okay, I'm no longer your king. I'm going to still keep the world going, but not as your king until you invite me to be your king. Once we invite God and we proclaim him as our king, we coronate him, he accepts the position for a year. So during the year, we don't have to do it anymore. Now, it doesn't mean you can't take the lessons of Rosh Hashanah and apply it throughout the year. not only could you do it, you should do it, but the intensity of it has to happen only that time of the year when God is being asked to become the king again.